Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the classified case of the girl in room 12 that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. There are places on the map that resist erasure, no matter how many times the ink is scrubbed away. In the brittle winter of 1893, a county clerk, hands numb by the cold and the monotony of tax ledgers, stumbled upon a bundle of documents bound with surgical gauze in the shadowed county archives in Stoughton, Virginia. Most were little more than waterlogged contracts and deeds. Their words bled into oblivion. But at the bottom of the stack, a single linen-backed map emerged unsigned, official in its format, and curiously centered not on the town, nor the county, but on the grounds of a hospital long since demolished. The map's surface was a palimpsest of faded graphite and ink, with room numbers scrawled in a hand that trembled with urgency. Except for one. Room 12 appeared twice once, bold and certain. In the west wing, where it was known to exist, again, faintly mirrored on the opposite side, where no hallway had ever been built. Between the two, a dotted line meandered into nothingness, ending in a margin note that read, "Version discrepancy unresolved. Do not seal." It was a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The map was quietly filed under architectural exceptions, its origins unclaimed, its purpose unspoken. No engineer ever stepped forward to explain the phantom corridor, and no administrator recalled authorizing its inclusion. Yet, as the clerk's eyes lingered on the ink, a chill seemed to seep from the paper itself, a sense that the path, though never constructed, had been walked before. If one listened closely, the silence of the records office was not empty, but expectant, as if the walls themselves remembered a story that no one dared to tell. St. Augustine's Infirmary, the institution at the heart of this enigma, stood in Albemarle County like a wound that refused to heal. Built in the aftermath of the Civil War, its brickwork bore the scars of a nation still learning to live with its ghosts. The hospital's west wing, where room 12 was said to reside, faced the encroaching woods, a tangle of bare branches that clawed at the windows in winter, and in summer pressed their green shadows against the glass. The grounds were ringed by a low stone wall, half swallowed by moss, and the only road in was a rutted track that vanished beneath the trees. According to the county's own ledgers, the infirmary was isolated by necessity, a phrase that concealed as much as it revealed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of carbolic and old paper. The corridors echoed with the shuffle of slippers and the distant clatter of meal trays. But beneath the routine, there was a tension, an unspoken understanding that some rooms were best left undisturbed. The staff, drawn from the surrounding villages and the ranks of war widows, moved with a practiced discretion. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flickering away from certain doors. The children's ward, in particular, was a place of uneasy quiet, its windows barred not for safety, but for secrecy. The social fabric of the time was woven with suspicion and silence. In the years following the war, Virginia's institutions were under constant scrutiny, their funding precarious, their records subject to sudden review, the state's new bureaucratic machinery, eager to assert control, demanded order and compliance. Yet, in the shadowed corners of St. Augustine's, order was a fragile veneer. The hospital's ledgers were immaculate, but the margins told a different story. Notations in unfamiliar hands, pages glued at odd angles, entries that skipped numbers or vanished altogether, according to a surviving memo from the era. Exceptions are to be handled with discretion. Anomalies are not to be discussed in open correspondence. The phrase would echo through the years, a mantra for those who found themselves on the wrong side of the ledger. It was into this world of half-truths and hidden corridors that a child arrived on a cold January morning in 1874. Her name, now redacted from every surviving copy of the intake register, was once written in a careful, looping script female, white, unaccompanied. The nurse who recorded her entry hesitated over the year of birth, first writing 1865, then, on the reverse, 1871. Both dates were inscribed in the same hand, the same ink, as if the act of correction had been abandoned midway. No line was drawn through the contradiction. Instead, a marginal note appeared unresolvable. Proceed with 1871 as the primary index. The directive bore the initials of Dr. L. H. Corwin, chief of the children's ward, a man whose reputation for precision bordered on obsession. Corwin's personal notes, preserved only in fragments, betray a mind both fascinated and unsettled by his new charge. Subject presents with impossible dualities. He wrote, not developmental delay, but time indeterminate behavior, displays memory of events not yet discussed, requires passive observation. The girl was assigned to room 12, a repurposed servant's chamber at the far end of the west wing. The room had no windows, no fireplace, and only one key, held by the matron. Hospital policy dictated that children under 10 be quartered within sight of the nurse's station. Yet no one questioned her placement. The record closed around her like a sealed envelope. From the outset, the child's presence unsettled the routine of the ward. She was reported as 3 years old, based on the 1871 date. But her speech was fluent. Her reading comprehension was advanced, and she refused milk in favor of clove water, a preference more common among adults. Her temperature fluctuated wildly without sign of infection. Her weight remained constant, and her handwriting, when permitted to copy letters, matched no known standard taught in the region. Most troubling was her relationship to time. During a preliminary evaluation, when asked, "What year is it?" she replied, "That depends." And then, with unsettling calm, "Which version of the year are you asking about?" The staff, accustomed to trauma and confusion, attributed her disorientation to shock. But Corwin did not concur. His notes shifted in tone after that encounter, abandoning clinical detachment for a guarded ambiguity. He ceased referring to her by name or age, marking her chart instead with a symbol 2 vertical slashes with a gap between. That symbol, unique in his 22-year career, would become a cipher for the unspeakable. The girl's days unfolded in a pattern that defied the logic of the ward. She did not cry, did not resist, did not seem frightened by injections or examinations. She neither bonded with staff nor recoiled from them. She complied, but never answered to her name. The only question she asked, with unwavering consistency, was, "Which version of the year are we in?" At first, the staff dismissed it as a child's confusion, but over time, the precision of her phrasing became impossible to ignore. She never asked, "What year is it?" nor, "Is it still 1874 always?" Which version? Nurse Joanna Fields, who attended her on the night shift, began keeping a private journal, separate from the official log. She described the girl's peculiar sensitivity to repetition, not of routine, but of time itself. She does not like when the same hour repeats. Fields wrote, when a clock is wound incorrectly, she becomes still, as if waiting for it to catch up. This detail never reached Corwin's desk. In March, a new notation appeared in the margin of the girl's chart. Temporal identity disorder unclassifiable. No diagnosis by that name existed in the hospital's reference volume. When questioned later, none of the staff could recall who had written it. The ink matched no other pen used in her file, and the page on which it appeared had been affixed at a different angle than the others in the binding, as if inserted after the fact. More curious still was the growing fear among staff that her memory was not linear. During one evaluation, she listed the names of nurses who had not yet been assigned to her ward. 2 weeks later, those same women began rotation in room 12. The correlation was never formally recorded. Corwin, in what may be his most candid entry, wrote, "She speaks as if the future is already past, but unchosen. She does not ask to be believed, only to be correctly placed." After this, the frequency of his visits dropped sharply. He began declining his morning rounds in the West Wing, citing fatigue. His handwriting became less precise. His margins widened. Then, without explanation, Room 12's clock was removed. No memorandum ordered its removal. No entry in the maintenance logs accounts for its absence. Only a pale outline remained on the wall, where the dust had not yet filled in the shape. The hospital's administrative wing, once open to ward supervisors, became restricted. A new lock was installed on the filing room. According to a janitorial inventory from June, the room was entered only once between May 18th and July 2nd. On that date, the master log shows a brief entry in Latimer's hand 42227C child. Progress noted. Retain silence. No progress was ever defined. The girl in room 12 became a presence felt more in absence than in action. Her meals arrived, but with no dietary annotations. Sheets were laundered, but the cleaning staff signed no delivery slips. She was present, but unacknowledged, as though any language that risked defining her had been ruled inadmissible. Dr. Corwin, visibly diminished, ceased all case-related entries. His later handwriting became skeletal, words slanting downward as though avoiding the margins. One page in his personal notes reads, "Only, they did not need her consent. They did not need mine. They only required silence." In the years that followed, the story of Room 12 would become a rumor, a shadow in the margins of the hospital's history. But in the winter of 1874, as snow pressed against the windows and the clocks ticked in uncertain rhythm, a child sat in a windowless room, her eyes fixed not on the present, but on a version of the year that no one else could see. And somewhere, in the silence between the walls, the map waited its dotted line leading nowhere, or perhaps to the place where all forgotten stories begin. A subtle shift began to ripple through the daily rhythms of the infirmary. Almost imperceptible at first, a misplaced chart. A tray of food left outside a door that no one recalled assigning. A nurse's footsteps echoing in a corridor she swore she had just crossed moments before. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if the building were holding its breath, waiting for something unnamed to surface. It was in these small, persistent anomalies that the first cracks in the institution's carefully maintained order began to show. One evening, as dusk pressed its blue shadows against the window panes. Nurse Lydia Marsh found herself drawn to the records room by a sense of unease she could not explain. The door, usually locked and guarded by the matron's iron key, stood ajar. Inside, the lamplight flickered over stacks of ledgers and a single unmarked envelope resting atop the intake register. Marsh hesitated, her fingers trembling as she lifted the envelope. Within, she discovered a page torn from a patient log, the edges singed as if by hurried flame. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink a shade darker than any she had seen in the hospital's supply. It read, in a careful, deliberate script, "Two admitted, same week, different names, same eyes, same voice, same year. One to room 12, the other transferred." The words pulsed with a quiet dread. Marsh's mind raced with questions. Had she seen another child? A shadow flitting past the ward doors. A second presence that lingered just beyond the edge of memory she tried to recall. But her thoughts slipped away like water through her fingers. That night, she recorded in her private journal, "There are echoes in the halls. Sometimes I hear laughter. But when I turn, the sound is gone. I have begun to doubt the shape of my own recollections." Elsewhere in the infirmary, subtle disturbances multiplied. Meal trays prepared for one child were found already open, though the nurse on duty insisted she had not yet served them. Bed sheets bore the faint impression of a second body, smaller and lighter, as if someone had lain beside the patient only moments before. The staff whispered of doors that refused to stay closed, of clocks that lost time, of names that vanished from the duty roster overnight. The matron, a woman of stern discipline, dismissed these stories as fatigue and superstition. Yet, in the privacy of her office, she began to double-check the locks each evening, her hands shaking as she turned the key. The first open confrontation came not with a shout, but with a silence that spread like frost. During a routine inspection, Dr. Corwin discovered that the intake file for room 12 had been replaced with a blank sheet, glued carefully into the ledger. No signature, no date, no destination. The original page was gone. When he inquired, the administrative assistant avoided his gaze. Her voice, flat transfer, read under new authority. No further explanation was offered. Corwin's frustration simmered beneath his professional composure, but he sensed that to press further would be to invite consequences he could not predict. As the days passed, the sense of unease deepened. The staff began to notice patterns, small, insistent details that refused to be ignored. The child in room 12, once so silent, now hummed a lullaby that none of the nurses recognized, yet which seemed to echo faintly in the corridors long after she had ceased. On more than one occasion, a nurse would find herself pausing outside the door, overcome by the sensation that someone was watching from within, though the room appeared empty. The hospital's routine, once so rigid, now felt brittle, as if a single misstep might shatter the fragile peace. It was during this period that Nurse Marsh, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, began to keep a second journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the laundry room. In its pages, she documented every oddity, every fleeting glimpse of a second child, every unexplained sound or movement. She sketched two side profiles of what appeared to be the same girl, one marked AM, the other PM. The only difference was the direction of the eyes, one looking left, the other right. Marsh wrote, "I tucked one in, but there were two impressions on the bed. The hospital logs list only one mattress requisitioned for room 12 this season. The pressure on the staff mounted. The matron began to rotate nurses more frequently, citing the need for fresh eyes on the ward. Yet, with each new arrival, the sense of disquiet only grew. Some nurses reported dreams of wandering endless corridors, always searching for a door that would not open. Others awoke with the certainty that they had forgotten something vital, a name or a face that hovered just out of reach. The hospital's atmosphere became charged with a nervous energy, as if the very walls were listening. Then, without warning, a sealed envelope bearing a federal insignia arrived at the infirmary. The courier, a man in a dark coat with no visible badge, delivered it directly to the administrator's office and departed without a word. Inside the envelope was a dossier stamped 4227C child. The number did not match any known medical code. The administrator, Byron Latimer, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol, made no mention of the document in his private ledger. By nightfall, the original intake paperwork for room 12 had vanished from the hospital's files. In its place, a placeholder sheet bore only a date and the cryptic notation Archive 4227C child, 18th May. From that moment, the language of the institution began to change. Staff were instructed, verbally and only once, not to refer to the patient by any designation beyond her room assignment. Written orders, if they existed, did not survive. The absence itself became protocol. Nurses who had cared for the girl were reassigned to other wards without explanation. Marcia's private journal ended abruptly on the day the file arrived. No further entries mentioned the child.
Dr. Matthew,
Corwin's demeanor shifted. He began to attend room 12 without his usual notebook, relying instead on brief mental recitations that he would scribble down later, alone. His entries, reconstructed from fragments, became more abstract. One line, written in a cramped hand and half erased, read, "There is a difference between not remembering and not being allowed to recall. The administrative wing, once a place of order, now felt like a labyrinth of locked doors and whispered instructions. The hospital's master log, once immaculate, began to show gaps, pages missing, entries skipped, signatures that did not match any staff on file. The winter of 1875 arrived late, bringing with it a stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned hands. On a morning thick with fog, a dark coach appeared at the administrative portico. Two men, neither in uniform nor clerical badge, entered the superintendent's office and remained for 23 minutes. When they left, one carried a brass-plated file drawer labeled 4227C child. No meals were delivered to room 12 that hour. No rounds were recorded. The only note tacked to the staff board read, 4227C child records have been temporarily relocated for public health continuity. The effect was immediate and chilling. The child's presence became spectral. Her meals arrived, but with no dietary notes. Her sheets were laundered, but no one signed the delivery slips. She was there, yet unacknowledged, as though any language that risked defining her had been ruled inadmissible. Dr. Corwin, visibly diminished, ceased all case-related entries. His later handwriting became skeletal, words slanting downward as though avoiding the margins. One page in his personal notes reads, "Only, they did not need her consent. They did not need mine. They only required silence." The staff, once so diligent, now moved through the ward with a kind of haunted caution. Medical students assigned to the West Wing were abruptly reassigned. The ward clerk, who had previously maintained immaculate logbooks, began leaving entry lines blank, only to return later with ink blots obscuring entire columns. A janitor reported seeing one of the escorting men return alone weeks later, though no official record of his presence existed. The man was said to have retrieved an object from behind the heating grate in room 12, placing it carefully into a wooden box marked only with a brass plate. In the aftermath, the hospital's routines resumed, but the sense of normalcy was a brittle facade. The walls of room 12 were painted a pale gray, the same color used in the isolation quarters. Though the child had not been deemed violent or unstable, no mention of her exit appeared in hospital records. The last entry for her room in the ward log was on June 29th at 11:04 a.m., signed by a nurse whose signature matched none of the staff on file. After that, the logbook skipped a page not torn, not blank, just missing. The institution, once a place of healing, had become a theater of silence and omission. The staff, bound by unspoken rules, moved through their days with the uneasy knowledge that some stories were not meant to be told. And in the heart of the West Wing, behind a door with no name, a child waited, her presence a riddle, her history a wound that refused to close. The secrets of room 12, once whispered in the margins, now pulsed at the center of the hospital's collective unease, a mystery that grew darker with every attempt to erase it. A single photograph, unearthed decades later in a box of estate miscellany, would become the first irrefutable evidence that the story of room 12 was not merely a legend whispered among hospital staff. The image, a gelatin silver print measuring 4 by 6 inches, captured a simple cot in a nondescript room. The wool blanket was tucked with military precision. A wooden chair stood beside a washstand, and the paint on the walls flaked in even strokes. At first glance, it was unremarkable until the eye was drawn to the mirror on the far wall. In the reflection, the bed showed 2 distinct impressions, one deep, the full weight of a sleeping body, the other faint, as if someone smaller had sat only briefly before vanishing. Forensic analysis, conducted years after the hospital's closure, confirmed the negative bore no evidence of double exposure or tampering. The mirror's image was structurally sound, its contradiction unexplained. This photograph was not the only artifact to survive the hospital's campaign of silence. In a hidden compartment beneath a warped floorboard, a diary surfaced, its pages yellowed, the ink faded but legible. The author, Nurse Lydia Marsh, had vanished from all official records, her name absent from payroll ledgers and census rolls. Yet her handwriting matched the infirmary's stationery, and her entries chronicled a reality that defied rational explanation. She wrote of 2 girls admitted in the same week, different names but the same eyes, the same voice, the same year. One was assigned to room 12, the other transferred elsewhere, never to be seen again. Marsh's sketches depicted 2 identical profiles, marked AM and PM, their only difference the direction of their gaze. The diary's most chilling entry described a night when Marsh tucked one child into bed, only to find 2 impressions on the mattress at dawn. The hospital's supply logs, cross-referenced for accuracy, listed only 1 mattress requisitioned for room 12 that season. Marsh's account was corroborated by a series of tray logs. Meals delivered to the room were returned in patterns that defied logic, some empty and cold, others sealed yet warm, as if untouched by human hands. A porter's note, scrawled in the margin, read, "Meal unclaimed, plate warm to the touch, no scent." These details, mundane in isolation, formed a lattice of evidence that no administrator could dismiss. As the investigation deepened, more fragments emerged. A requisition form for sedatives, unsigned but initialed, cited instance 12 as the patient. The handwriting did not match any staff on record in the margins of medical files across several institutions. A new phrase began to appear: cognitive dissonance of unnatural origin, always written in red ink, always unsigned. The term was never formally adopted but spread like a whispered warning. Forensic reports from the period confirmed that the ink used was not consistent with the hospital's supply, and the script bore irregularities suggesting a hand trained outside conventional clerical instruction. The most damning evidence, however, was not found in the hospital at all. In the archives of a federal cryptographic research facility, a shipment log listed subject 4227C, juvenile female, preserved brain section marked temporal disarray. No death certificate existed, no surgical record, no coroner's note. The sample was assigned not to a medical laboratory, but to a division specializing in nonlinear data sets and biological anomalies. The canister, lined with lead and brass, bore a sigil of 3 concentric circles, its meaning untraceable. The shipment's provenance was listed as an unspecified Army archive. Cold Storage Vault 4. The vault itself was demolished years later, its floor plans showing no provision for medical containers, only cipher disks and sealed courier satchels. The image of the canister's sigil was later found sketched in the margins of forgotten files, a testament to a reality that refused to be buried. These artifacts, scattered and incomplete, formed a mosaic of truth that could not be denied. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the official response was the silence. The hospital's records were purged, the room bricked over, and the names of those involved erased from every ledger that dared to record them. But the photograph remained. The diary survived, and the canister's sigil lingered in the collective memory, a testament to a reality that refused to be buried. As the weight of evidence mounted, the psychological toll on those who had participated in the cover-up became impossible to ignore. Dr. Corwin, once the paragon of clinical detachment, began to unravel. His private notes, recovered from a water-damaged fieldbook, revealed a mind tormented by guilt and uncertainty. There is a difference between not remembering and not being allowed to recall, he wrote. The words were half erased beneath frantic annotations. He confessed to omitting details from the public record, to marking the child's chart with symbols instead of names, to acquiescing in the face of federal directives he did not understand. Other staff members, too, began to break their silence. Nurse Marsh's final entries grew erratic, her handwriting slanting wildly across the page. She described feeling watched in empty rooms, of clocks that measured only surface time, of a lullaby hummed by a child who no longer spoke. The matron, once so resolute, was found weeping in her office, her keys clutched in trembling hands. She admitted to removing pages from the intake register, to painting the walls of room 12 a color she could not name, to following orders she could not recall receiving. The confessions, when they came, were not shouted, but whispered. They were fragments of memory pieced together in the margins of journals, in unsigned memos. In the silence that followed, a question no one dared to ask. The scale of the deception became clear. The institution had not merely failed to protect a vulnerable child. It had conspired to erase her existence, to rewrite the boundaries of memory itself. The horror was not in the violence of the act, but in the cold efficiency with which it was carried out. The staff, bound by fear and protocol, had become complicit in a crime that had left no visible wound but scarred the conscience of all who touched it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the wider community. News of the hospital's secrets spread beyond its moss-covered walls, carried by rumors and the occasional leak of a document too strange to be ignored. Legal authorities, once content to defer to federal oversight, found themselves compelled to act. A special commission was convened, its mandate to investigate the disappearance of records, the manipulation of medical files, and the unexplained transfer of a juvenile patient known only as 427C child. Testimony from the period records the confusion and fear that gripped the staff. Many claim to remember nothing, their memories fragmented or missing entirely. Others recounted dreams of mirrored rooms and voices that echoed in empty corridors. The commission's findings were damning. The hospital had engaged in systematic erasure of evidence. The staff had been coerced into silence, and federal agents had intervened to suppress the truth. The report concluded that the events surrounding Room 12 constitute a breach of ethical and legal standards, the effects of which may never be fully understood. The legal consequences were swift and severe. The hospital's license was revoked, its administrators dismissed, and several staff members faced charges of obstruction and falsification of records. The federal agencies involved refused to cooperate, citing matters of national security. The community, once proud of its institution, was left reeling, its trust shattered, its history rewritten. The building itself, stripped of its purpose, stood as a monument to the dangers of unchecked authority and the fragility of memory. Yet, even as justice was pursued, the true cost of the cover-up became apparent. Families of former patients demanded answers, their grief compounded by the realization that their loved ones' stories had been stolen. The medical community, forced to confront its own complicity, began to question the boundaries of diagnosis and the ethics of institutional silence. New protocols were established, oversight committees formed, and the language of cognitive dissonance of unnatural origin was quietly retired from official use. In the end, the legacy of Room 12 was not one of closure, but of warning. The evidence, once hidden, now stood in plain sight: a photograph, a diary, a canister marked with a sigil no one could decipher. The confessions, once whispered, became part of the public record, and the hospital, once a place of healing, was remembered as a site of erasure, where the boundaries between truth and silence were drawn not in ink, but in the shadows that lingered long after the doors were closed. The collapse was not sudden, but it was absolute. In the months that followed, the exposure of the hospital's secrets, the very foundation of the institution, seemed to rot from within. The West Wing, once a place of whispered authority, was left to the encroaching dampness and the slow, relentless advance of mold. Windows were boarded, doors chained shut, and the corridors that had once echoed with the measured steps of nurses now rang hollow with the sound of wind and the distant, uncertain creak of settling beams. The community, stripped of its pride, turned away from the building as if it were a wound that could not be healed, a scar best left unseen. Official records state that the hospital was decommissioned, its staff scattered, its archives boxed and sent to distant storage. But the truth was less orderly. Files vanished in transit, names were redacted, and entire years of patient logs were lost to clerical error. The process of dismantling the institution was as haunted as its final days. Workers tasked with bricking over the West Wing reported tools gone missing, blueprints that no longer matched the physical space, and a persistent sense of being watched. One foreman, in a statement later filed with the county, described finding a door that appeared on no plan, opening onto a blank wall. It was as if the building itself was trying to hide something, he wrote, or perhaps to remember. The town's identity, once so closely tied to the hospital's reputation, fractured under the weight of scandal. Families who had sent their children to the infirmary now spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all. The local school, which had once boasted of its partnership with the institution, quietly removed all references from its records. The church, too, found itself divided. Some parishioners demanded public atonement, while others insisted that the past be buried along with the building's bricks. The sense of community, already fragile, splintered into suspicion and silence. Yet, even as the physical structure decayed, the legacy of what had transpired within its walls refused to fade. The land itself seemed to resist reclamation. Grass grew in uneven patches. Trees leaned away from the foundation, and animals avoided the grounds. Children dared each other to approach the boarded windows, but none lingered long. The air was heavy, as if saturated with the residue of secrets too dense to dissipate. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows stretched across the empty lot, some claimed to hear faint music, an unplaceable lullaby, drifting on the wind. In the years that followed, the fate of those most closely entwined with the hospital's history became a subject of quiet speculation. Dr. Corwin, whose name had once commanded respect, withdrew from public life. He was last seen boarding a train to the coast, his luggage marked only with his initials. No obituary was ever published, and his estate was left unclaimed. Some whispered that he had changed his name, others that he had lost his memory entirely. Nurse Marsh, whose diary had become a key piece of evidence, simply vanished. Her last known address was found abandoned, a single page torn from her journal pinned to the door. Some stories are not meant to be finished. The handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakably hers. The administrator, Byron Latimer, was removed from office under a cloud of suspicion. He spent his remaining years in a small town far from Albemarle, refusing all interviews and correspondence. The matron, once the embodiment of order, was said to have developed a fear of closed doors, insisting that every room in her home remain open, day and night. The staff, scattered across the state, carried with them a silence that was both shield and shackle. Some found work in other institutions, but many left the profession altogether, unable to reconcile their memories with the official narrative. A few, in rare moments of candor, admitted to waking in the night, certain they'd heard a child's voice calling from the end of a darkened hallway. But the most enduring legacy was not found in the ruined building or the vanished staff. It lingered in the margins of medical literature, in the whispered warnings passed between nurses, in the cautionary tales told to new interns. The phrase cognitive dissonance of unnatural origin was quietly retired, but its shadow remained. Historians note that, for decades after the hospital's closure, similar cases were reported in distant counties, children who spoke of years that had not yet come, who remembered faces no one else had seen, who asked, with unsettling calm, which version of the year is this? In one instance, a physician in Maryland recorded a patient who refused to acknowledge her own reflection, insisting it answered incorrectly. The case was closed without explanation. Artifacts continued to surface in the most unlikely places. A fragment of mirror, its backing silvered and flaked, was found in the attic of a farmhouse miles from the hospital site. The glass bore a faint impression, as if pressed by a child's hand. In a university archive, a misfiled photograph showed a room with 2 beds, though the records listed only 1 patient. A ledger, discovered in a box of surplus medical supplies, contained a single entry: no noise upon entry. Avoid eye contact. Knock only once. Each piece, mundane in isolation, formed a constellation of evidence that pointed to a truth too vast to be contained by any single narrative. The questions left behind were as persistent as they were unanswerable. What became of the second child, the one who was transferred, whose name was never recorded? Why did the hospital's blueprints show a room that could not be found? A corridor that led nowhere? Who wrote the final note in Nurse Marsh's diary? And why did her handwriting change in the last pages? The official investigations closed with more questions than answers. And the files, once so meticulously kept, now bore the marks of erasure and uncertainty. In the decades that followed, the story of Room 12 became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told in the flicker of candlelight and the hush of late-night shifts. Medical students debated the ethics of institutional silence, while archivists pored over faded documents, searching for patterns in the chaos. The hospital's ruins, eventually cleared to make way for a new development, yielded no further evidence. Yet, those who had walked its halls spoke of a feeling that lingered, a sense that the past was not finished with them, that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. And so, the narrative circles back to its beginning, not with resolution, but with a deepening of the mystery. The evidence remains, scattered and incomplete, a challenge to those who would seek to impose order on the disorder of history. The legacy of Room 12 is not a lesson, but a warning that the boundaries between truth and silence are porous, that the past is never as distant as we would like to believe, and that some stories, no matter how carefully erased, will always find a way to be told. What then is to be learned from the shadows that gather in the margins of the record? Is justice a matter of exposure or of remembrance? Can the truth ever be fully known, or is it always refracted through the lens of fear and forgetting? The story of Room 12 resists closure, its final chapter unwritten, its secrets still echoing in the spaces between words. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this, that the greatest danger lies not in what is remembered, but in what is deliberately forgotten. The hospital is gone, the staff dispersed, the files redacted. Yet, the question lingers, as persistent as the chill that settles in an empty corridor. If you found yourself standing before a door that should not exist, would you open it? And if you did, would you recognize the world that lies on the other side? In the end, the only certainty is uncertainty itself. The past is not a closed book, but a palimpsest, its pages rewritten, its ink never fully dry. The story of Room 12 is not finished. It waits, patient and silent, for the next hand to turn the page. And as long as there are those willing to look, to question, to remember, the shadows will never be entirely banished. So, if you ever find yourself drawn to a place that feels out of time, where the air is heavy with secrets and the walls seem to listen, remember, some doors are meant to remain closed, and some stories, once heard, can never be forgotten. Yet, Even as the years pass and the world changes, the echoes of Room 12 persist in the most unexpected ways. In a small town hundreds of miles away, a child is found wandering the edge of a field, clutching a scrap of paper with a single phrase pressed into its surface. This version is not the original. Do not follow. The handwriting is unfamiliar, but the message is unmistakable, a warning, or perhaps an invitation to those who would seek answers where none can be found. In a government archive, a clerk stumbles upon a misfiled memorandum stamped with a code that matches no known system. The document is brief, its language clinical, but in the margin, a note is scrawled in greenish black ink. If memory persists longer than instruction permits, report for review under Tier 2 recalibration. The file is quickly removed, but the impression remains, a ghostly trace of a story that refuses to be erased. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is at its most vulnerable, there are those who claim to hear footsteps in empty corridors, the soft click of a door that should not open, the faintest echo of a lullaby sung in a language no one remembers. These are the remnants of a history that cannot be contained, the shadows that gather at the edge of understanding, waiting for someone, anyone to ask the right question. So, as you turn away from this story, as the final words fade and the screen grows dark, consider what it means to remember and what it means to forget. The legacy of Room 12 is not just a tale of loss and erasure, but a challenge to all who would seek the truth, to look beyond the surface, to question the official record, to listen for the voices that linger in the silence. For in the end, it is not the answers that haunt us, but the questions we are afraid to ask. And somewhere in the labyrinth of history, a door remains closed, not locked, but waiting. Will you be the one to open it? And if you do, will you recognize the world that lies on the other side?